The endocrine system. Boop. So we mentioned this in class, but just a bit of review. So there are two types of glands. There's the exocrine glands. They typically secrete fluids externally to the external surface of the body, but I also told you it's also to the surface of organs. So a prime example of that is stomach acid reaching the lumen of digestive tract, and the lumen is part of the intestines. Another example is sweat being released to the surface of the skin, and those are the glands that are using ducts. The other types of glands, which is what we're focusing on for this unit, are the endocrine glands, and those glands are secreting hormones directly to the bloodstream, or if they're not directly close to a blood vessel, they'll go to the extracellular fluid, which can either be directly around them as a gland or around their target cells. So here is how hormones act on specific cells, and this is actually showing 4 different processes. So here we have something called a paracrine secretion. This is a different type of hormone secretion in that the hormones will be secreted by a cell into the interstitial fluid. Interstitial fluid is just the fluid that fills extracellular spaces in between matter, so cells. And then these hormones will only affect neighboring cells. So these hormones don't enter the bloodstream. We're not going to focus on that. We're only going to focus on our endocrine. Here we have the hormonal secretion. So we'll have our secreting endocrine cell secrete its hormones into the bloodstream. And then the target cells have receptors that the hormones can bind to. Only those target cells have the receptors for that hormone. So all cells aren't going to have all these receptors, or else it won't be organized. And they have very specific binding sites. So these hormones will only bind to specific receptors. If a cell has more receptors on it, which can happen, they have different numbers of receptors, and a hormone binds to more receptors on the target cell, that has a greater response. If it binds to less receptors on the target cell, it has a lower response. And the number of receptors on a target cell can change. There's a process called upregulation, which is the increase in receptors in response to a prolonged decrease in hormone. It's very similar to supply and demand. So as the supply of hormone goes down, the number of receptors go up. There's also downregulation, which is as the number of hormone levels increase, the number of receptors decreases. So you can decrease the amount of receptors on the target cells as well. So hormones are what are secreted by our endocrine glands. They can control the rates of some chemical reactions. They can help substances travel through cell membranes. They also help regulate our water balance, our electrolyte balance, and our blood pressure. And they're also involved in our growth, our development, our behaviors, and our reproduction. So just reiterating, they also help coordinating and producing energy, which is really awesome for us. And they help us to react to external stimuli so that we can produce a response. This is seen mostly in like fight or flight responses, or relax and repose, with the secretion of norepinephrine or epinephrine. So homeostasis is where we have a nice maintenance of balance. We maintain our coordination. I don't understand why there's a picture of this man without much clothing on skis, but he looks happy, so let's just leave him alone. So endocrine glands, they are ductless, and they release their products, their hormones, directly into the bloodstream or extracellular fluid outside of cells. So extracellular fluid is the same thing as interstitial fluid, and that those words extracellular and interstitial are referring to the spaces outside of cells where there are no other cells. So it's not empty, but it is filled with fluid, typically very water-based. And then the extracellular matrix is that space, and then it's filled with extracellular or interstitial fluid. So that's just some clarification. So the endocrine system is composed of ductless glands, let's just say that again, and they produce those hormones. So the endocrine glands, there are larger ones, but there are also small groups of specialized cells that also produce hormones. Those are like the testes and the ovaries. The larger glands, which is the pituitary, which is found up here in the brain, We have the thyroid and the parathyroid, which is right here kind of in your throat. The adrenals is on your kidney, and then your pancreas. Those are the heavy hitters, and those are ones that we're going to focus on. But like I said, there are those other small groups. So we also have the testes and the ovaries and the thymus and the pineal body. The hypothalamus, what that does is it stimulates the pituitary to release hormones, and then the hormones that the pituitary releases stimulates other endocrine glands to secrete hormones as well. So that's why the hypothalamus is considered the control center of the endocrine system. So, like I said earlier, the hormones will usually go to target cells, and they regulate and coordinate systems of the body. They go to target cells via the bloodstream, and then they bind to those specific receptors on those target cells. So there's two types of endocrine disorders you can have. You can have a hyposecretion, which is the gland is not secreting enough of its hormone, or you can have a hypersecretion, which is the gland is secreting too much of its hormone. So there's generally two categories of hormones. They are all organic compounds. They can either be steroid or steroid-like hormones, or they can be non-steroids. And there's 4 different types of non-steroids. There's amines, peptides, proteins, and glycoproteins. And they all function similarly, so we're going to group them into the amino acid-based hormones. And then all steroid hormones, which are fat-soluble, they are derived from cholesterol. So once the hormones are secreted into the bloodstream, they go to their target cells, and that's where they're inducing a response. And they do it in very specific ways. So protein-based hormones will bind to receptors in the cell membrane because they cannot diffuse through the membrane because they are not fat-soluble. So they will bind to the membrane, and it starts a cascade. And this is a general cascade that happens for all amino acid-based hormones. And then what happens after step 3 is specific to its hormone. So the hormone is considered the first messenger, and it binds to a receptor on the cell membrane. So here we have outside the cell, inside the cell, and these are membranes or proteins that are embedded in the membrane. So it will bind to a receptor membrane. This complex, it's a hormone receptor complex, will activate a G protein. This G protein will then activate cyclic AMP. It will activate this adenylate cyclase, which is an enzyme. Once that gets activated, this enzyme adenylate cyclase will phosphorylate ATP and create cyclic AMP. And this is called the second messenger. And what cyclic AMP does is it will then activate protein kinases, which are also enzymes, and protein kinases will activate proteins. Those activated proteins are what alter chemical processes, cell processes, metabolism according to the hormone. So we needed this whole cascade. The final product is an activated protein that will then cause the response that we want. So here's another diagram showing it. So we have our hormone binding to our receptor. That will, right here, activate our G protein. That will cause adenylate cyclase to phosphorylate cyclic AMP, our second messenger. That will activate protein kinase, and then this. It will trigger responses from our target cell. And here's some examples. It can activate enzymes, stimulate cell secretion, which is exocytosis. It can open up ion channels, sodium potassium pumps. It can also induce transcription. Steroid hormones are different because they are fat soluble. They can diffuse directly into the cell. So these steroid hormones can enter any cell in the body. And their receptors are not found on the cell membrane, but they're found either in the cytoplasm, but usually in the nucleus of cells. So once the hormone binds to its receptor here, it will bind to specific DNA sequences in the nucleus. And that will cause that portion of DNA, so the gene, to be activated or inhibited. If it activates the gene will go through protein synthesis, so transcription and translation. It will create a protein, and then that protein that is created will bring about the cell changes associated with that hormone. So here we have our, this is a terrible diagram. Let's go to the next one. So here we have our steroid hormone will enter the cell. It doesn't even bind to its receptor until it got into the nucleus. Here is our receptor hormone complex, looks like candy corn. It binds to a specific gene on DNA in the nucleus. This is an activating one, so it activates this gene. The gene goes through transcription. Here's our messenger RNA, travel to the ribosomes and make our new protein. This protein is now going to be responsible for carrying out that cellular response that we wanted based on the hormone that was released. So negative feedback, it is when we get away from our set point. So we go either above or below the set point. Negative feedback is going back to the set point. This is just a convoluted way of saying that. Here's another example with cars if you're still a little hazy on negative feedback loops. So negative feedback negates the change. So we have three players here. We have the receptor, the control center, which is your brain, and that is what is delegating what the set point is. And we have the effectors, so the things actually responsible for getting us back to the set point. In positive feedback, this is where you're amplifying the change. So here our stretch receptors are stimulated, and then they send that impulse to our control center, which is our brain, and then the hypothalamus, which is the endocrine control center, it stimulates oxytocin to be released, which turns on the effectors. And the effectors here are the uterine muscles, and that stimulates those uterine muscles to continue to contract. So we're getting farther away from our set point, which is no contractions, to get the baby out. But remember, like main homeostasis is no baby in the uterus. So to get back to homeostasis, we had to amplify this change to return to our set point. These are just two examples of diseases associated with the endocrine system, but we're going to go through a lot more when we do our presentation, so just keep that in mind. So the nervous system and the endocrine system are very similar in that they're both releasing chemicals to induce a response. So the nervous system secretes neurotransmitters, whereas the endocrine system secretes hormones. And the nervous system sends the impulse from neuron to neuron, whereas the endocrine system utilizes the bloodstream. The nervous system has a very quick reaction. It's very short, not very long lasting, so it's a very fast response. Whereas the endocrine is a very slow reaction. It does take time, but the reaction is very long lasting. So this table and this table, is there another one? No. These two tables sum up the main hormones, the glands that secrete them, their target tissues, and the effects they have on the body. So if you're still working on your project, this is a great table to reference, and these are the main hormones that we are going to be focusing on. I will make a second video that goes along with each of the main glands and the hormones they secrete and their target tissues and those effects. The main ones we need to really focus on are blood oxygen levels and how that homeostasis is maintained, and also diabetes and insulin levels. So I'll make a second video. It will be optional, and I'll post that sometime this week. All right, I'll see you guys on Monday. Bye.